At the beginning of the film, a widower named Frank is seen relaxing on his balcony. Shortly after, Frank receives a call from his daughter, Anna, who is studying out of town. Anna asks if Frank will visit her, as tomorrow is her birthday. Hearing this, Frank assures her that he'll come to see her the next day. After the call, Frank quickly heads out to work. It turns out Frank is a police officer in the criminal division, known for his tough approach. Soon after, Frank is assigned by his supervisor to track down a suspect in a serial murder case. He sets out on the mission with his close colleague Doug. On their way, Frank asks Doug about the suspect's whereabouts. Doug explains that the suspect is currently posing as a laborer and, according to their information, is at the harbor. When they arrive at the harbor, Doug reminds Frank to bring the suspect in alive and just take him to the police station. Soon after, Frank and Doug locate the suspect and instruct him to come with them. However, the suspect refuses and quickly grabs a weapon from his shoe, taking a worker hostage. In that moment, the suspect demands that Frank put down his gun and leave the harbor with Doug. But Frank and Doug refuse to comply, leading to a shootout and chase. During the confrontation, the suspect is killed after being hit by a car, while Frank suffers a head injury and loses consciousness, with blood trickling from his ear. 11 months later, Frank is shown using a hearing aid, as the incident left his hearing impaired. However, his hearing aid often malfunctions, creating sudden, piercing sounds. Shortly after, Frank receives a call from Anna, who has returned to college out of town. Anna frequently encourages Frank to use sign language, understanding his new condition, though Frank feels self-conscious about it. Anna then mentions that she has a music recital in a month and hopes he can attend. Frank promises to be there no matter what. But just then, Frank's hearing aid malfunctions again, forcing him to cut his conversation with his daughter short. That evening, the police request Frank to visit a murder scene on the outskirts of town. However, as he attempts to question a witness, his hearing aid malfunctions again, making it difficult for him to focus. Frustrated, Frank decides to leave and later visits his regular doctor to check both his hearing and the frequent issues with his hearing aid. After examining him, the doctor informs Frank that his hearing aid isn't actually broken. Instead, his auditory nerves are steadily weakening. Because of this, she warns Frank that he should start learning sign language more seriously, as he may eventually lose his hearing entirely beyond the aid of any device. The following morning, Frank sits alone in a bar, contemplating his future and wondering whether he should retire due to his hearing condition. Soon, his close friend Doug joins him. It turned out, Doug is no longer in the criminal division with Frank, as he transferred to the narcotics division about 6 months ago. At that moment, Doug mentions a massacre that occurred 2 days ago, orchestrated by a drug cartel. He explains that a woman had witnessed the incident, and he needs to speak with her as part of the investigation. However, the suspect, Ava, is both deaf and mute, so he asks Frank to help translate using sign language. Hearing this, Frank hesitates, admitting he isn't yet fluent in sign language and is still debating his own retirement. Encouraging Frank to stay on the force, Doug emphasizes how valuable his skills are. After a lengthy conversation, Frank agrees to help Doug meet with Ava and decides to continue serving as a police officer. The scene shifts to Ava, who receives a visit from Frank and Doug shortly after. Using sign language, Frank introduces himself and Doug as police detectives wanting to ask her some questions. Inside, Frank comments on how empty her apartment building feels. Because of this, Ava explains that the entire complex is set to be demolished, so most residents have already moved out. She plans to move the next day. Frank then asks about the cartel massacre, wanting to know if she has any information about it. In response, Ava shows them a video she managed to record during the incident, apologizing for not reporting it sooner, as fear had held her back. After watching the video, Frank and Doug decide to take her phone as evidence, promising to return it later that night. Before leaving, Frank excuses himself to use the restroom, where he notices a bottle of naloxone, a medication used to counteract drug overdoses. This discovery leads Frank to assume that Ava might be struggling with addiction. Later that night, Frank and Doug head home, with Doug expressing his gratitude to Frank for his help. Midway through his drive, Frank realizes he left his phone at Ava's apartment and quickly turns back. Meanwhile, a group of mafia members is seen entering Ava's apartment building. Unbeknownst to them, Ava had recorded them during their previous massacre. Once the group reached Ava's apartment, they kick down the door and force her to sit down quietly. At the same time, Frank arrives at the building to retrieve his phone. As he approaches Ava's apartment, he senses something is wrong, noticing a suspicious man standing guard outside her door. As a result, Frank pretends to be a resident heading toward a nearby window. From this place, he sees Ava being interrogated by the mafia boss, Lynch. At that moment, Lynch questions Ava, asking if she has any evidence of their massacre. She shakes her head, denying it, but Lynch realizes she's lying and orders his men to restrain her. Apparently, he plans to kill her by injecting a lethal dose of drugs, staging it as an overdose. Outside, Frank quietly climbs out the window and spots the gang members preparing to inject Ava. Acting quickly, he shoots one of Lynch's men and also manages to hit his assistant, Moretti. Running out of ammunition, Frank decides to flee with Ava, leading to a high-stakes chase through the building. They narrowly evade capture by ducking into an empty room to hide. Meanwhile, Lynch returns to check on Moretti, who is critically injured. Refusing to let him die, Lynch calls for a mafia-associated doctor and instructs his men downstairs to stay on high alert and prevent Frank and Ava from escaping. While they are hiding, Frank asks Ava if she's a drug addict, mentioning the anti-withdrawal medication he found in her bathroom. To his surprise, Ava denies being an addict. Not fully convinced, Frank presses her further, and Ava admits that although she was once addicted, she is now clean and hasn't touched drugs since then. Frank then asks if anyone else lives in the building who might be able to help, explaining that he needs a phone to call for backup. Ava tells him that someone still lives in apartment 23, and Frank decides to go there. Before he leaves, Ava requests that he signal her by slipping a dollar bill under the door when he returns. At the same time, the Dr. Lynch had called arrives on the ground floor, greeted by one of his men, who escorts her upstairs to tend to Moretti. Once there, Lynch directs the doctor to treat Moretti for the gunshot wound. Shortly after, Ava spots two police officers approaching, feeling a wave of relief, until she sees them talking with Lynch's men. Realizing that these officers are corrupt, her hope quickly fades. Not long after, Frank signals Ava to unlock her door, informing her that there was no one in apartment 23, nor was there any phone he could use. Ava then mentions she spotted two police officers earlier, but sadly, they're corrupt and in league with Lynch's gang. Meanwhile, Lynch stumbles upon Frank's phone and assumes that neither Frank nor Ava has contacted anyone. As a result, Lynch orders his men to hold their positions and instructs the corrupt officers to search each room for Ava and Frank. During this time, Ava suddenly recalls that there's an emergency phone in the elevator, which they could use to call for help. They quickly make their way toward it. However, just as they begin moving, Frank's hearing aid battery dies, leaving him unable to hear completely. They continue to the elevator on the 5th floor, where Frank attempts to call 911. Unable to hear the operator, Frank hangs up before anyone can respond. Unfortunately, Lynch's men, monitoring the CCTV, spot his actions and alert everyone, instructing them to head to the 5th floor elevator. Moments later, Frank and Ava are ambushed, but they manage to escape and enter the elevator, heading to the 7th floor. Realizing they're being watched through the camera, Frank destroys the elevator's CCTV feed. Instead of going to the 7th floor, they change course and go up to the 10th floor. Lynch, unaware of the detour, waits with his gun on the 7th floor, expecting them there. It turns out Frank and Ava's destination on the 10th floor is her apartment, hoping to retrieve her phone. But upon entering, they find Moretti seated there, prompting Frank to draw his weapon, despite it being out of ammunition. Unaware of this, Moretti appears intimidated. At the same time, Ava is held at gunpoint by the doctor, who is still present. Fortunately, the doctor, uninterested in getting involved, quickly leaves the room. Moretti then tries to radio Lynch and his men, but Frank stops him with a swift blow. Frank and Ava grab Moretti's phone and flee before Lynch and his crew arrive. Once in a safe spot, Frank video calls Doug. Their conversation is chaotic, as Frank can speak but can't hear Doug's responses. Luckily, Ava can read Doug's lips, helping Frank follow along. After the call, all they have to do is wait for Doug to arrive. However, unbeknownst to them, Lynch has tracked Frank through Moretti's phone. Soon after, Lynch's team breaks down the door. Just in time, Frank and Ava make a quick escape, sparking a tense chase through the building. During the chase, Ava realizes that Lynch's team has been tracking them through the phone and urges Frank to throw it away. 15 minutes later, they find a new hiding spot while waiting for Doug to arrive. As they take a moment to share stories of their past experiences, they spot Doug arriving. However, he comes alone, raising their concern for his safety. They decide to descend, using the emergency stairwell next to the elevator to help him. Just as Frank and Ava begin their descent, a corrupt officer suddenly points a gun at him. Using sign language, Frank signals Ava to jump to the stairwell while he handles the officer. Frank fights back and eliminates the officer, taking his weapon in the process. Frank and Ava then continue down the emergency stairwell. Reaching the second floor, Frank spots Doug cornered by one of Lynch's men. Not wanting Doug to get hurt, Frank surrenders, dropping his weapon. But Doug was only pretending, as he is also part of Lynch's gang. At the same time, Lynch and his team arrive. Lynch then injects Ava with a powerful dose of drugs, intending to overdose her. After that, he orders his men to take Ava and Frank up to her apartment on the 10th floor. Once there, they place Ava on her bed, making it appear as if she overdosed in her own home, while Frank is taken to a side room for interrogation. During this moment, Doug and Lynch attempt to bribe Frank to keep silent about what he's seen. They warn him that if he refuses, they'll kill him right there. Initially, Frank declines, but as Lynch grows agitated and threatens him with a gun, Frank reluctantly agrees. Soon after, as Frank and Lynch's team head to the elevator, Frank seizes an opportunity to trap them inside. He then rushes back to Ava's room to save her. Remembering the naloxone he saw earlier, an antidote for overdoses, Frank injects Ava with it just in time. Fortunately, Ava regains consciousness, but she immediately warning Frank that naloxone's effect only lasts for 10 minutes. Without further medical help, she could still die from the overdose. Realizing this, Frank instructs Ava to guard the door with the gun, while he sets a fire to draw attention to the apartment and summon help. A few moments later, Lynch appears by the window, prompting Ava to shoot him. Following this, Frank breaks through a partially broken bathroom wall, allowing them both to escape through it. Shortly afterward, Lynch arrives and searches the room, eventually discovering the hole in the wall. But as he investigates, Ava and Frank douse him with a caustic liquid, nearly blinding him. By this time, a crowd is gathered outside, including local police, medical teams, and firefighters. The scene shifts to Frank and Ava, who are heading to a musician's room in the building. At that moment, they plan to use their impaired hearing to their advantage by blasting music at full volume when Lynch's gang arrives. Not long after, Doug and Lynch enter the room and split up to search for Frank and Ava. Suddenly, deafening music fills the room. Disoriented by his blurred vision, Lynch accidentally shoots Doug, killing him. Lynch then approaches the sound system and manages to turn off the music. Meanwhile, Ava collapses as the naloxone has worn off. Lynch, still partially blind, approaches Ava, preparing to kill her. Before he can act, Frank intervenes, rescuing her. He quickly carries Ava out of the apartment building, leaving Lynch and Doug dead behind them. Outside, Ava is immediately treated by the medical team, while the local police surround Lynch's remaining men. 1 month later, Frank watches his daughter, Anna, perform music at her recital. He has chosen not to wear his hearing aid, embracing the silence in the lively environment. Shortly afterward, Ava, now fully recovered, approaches him. She asks about his hearing aid, and Frank replies that he doesn't wish to wear it. They then hold hands, revealing they've fallen for each other. Moral lesson from the story: when life gets loud, sometimes it's best to just turn off the volume and let your fists do the talking. And remember, you don't need perfect hearing to create chaos. Just a good plan and a lot of luck.